as Jean mentioned, my job is to do the very, very broad overview. You'll hopefully drill down into more details as the week goes on. But really, I want to set the stage this afternoon for Africa, the most interesting, diverse continent, and really emphasize at the outset this diversity of governments, peoples, languages. 54 states with the recent addition of South Sudan, all strung out along a really wide spectrum. You have the failed states on the one side, the Somalias, the Sudans that we hear about in the news a lot, and the ones we hear less about in the news, the good news stories, the well-governed African states, of which there are many, Botswana, Ghana, and others as well. And then this big, large mass of countries in between. Now, as Jean pointed out, Africa was for a long time viewed, at least by foreign policy realists, as irrelevant, unimportant, essentially a backwater, a continent of disease, poverty, conflict, you name it. Well, that vision, fortunately, that version of history, reading of history, is becoming outdated. US interests are growing, both in terms of opportunities and threats. Oh yeah, that's always what I forget to do, is use the PowerPoint. You got it. Good. Thanks very much. I can't multitask. I'm a typical man. All right, great. Thank you. So growing economic relevance as well for Africa, for the US. This is a region that's had solid growth in the last decade, on average 5% a year, up until the global economic slowdown in 2008. And Africa actually was hit less hard than other regions in this crisis. Also, in terms of energy supplies to the US, Africa is of growing importance. Also in diplomacy and crisis management. It's a continent you can't afford to ignore. A place of volatility and rapid change. Look only at the dizzying speed of events in North Africa since the turn of the year. That said, it's a paradox that although the US has woken up to the growing importance of Africa in recent years, the US probably wields less influence there than ever before. That's due to the emerging impact of other nations in Africa. We'll talk about that later. A quick explanation of what we mean by Africa. Different ways of classifying it, and depends which part of the government you work in. Obviously, there's this traditional division between North and Sub-Saharan region. Partly a reflection of geography. The Sahara is this imposing physical barrier, but also a reflection of important ethnic, regional, religious, social differences between the regions. So the State Department treats Africa as two separate entities, the Africa Bureau dealing with the Sub-Saharan part, as we do at CSIS, so my comments will probably reflect that bias towards the Sub-Saharan part of Africa, but we can definitely in the questions deal with all parts of Africa. DoD, of course, takes a different approach. The Africa Command, AFRICOM, deals with Africa as a whole, with the exception of Egypt. And that view of Africa is reflected by Africans themselves, who are less keen to see their continent carved up into pieces and prefer to treat it as a single entity. So it's a political body. The African Union includes everyone, apart from Morocco, which has had its own disputes with the AU. And there have been moves towards greater unity, ironically pushed by Colonel Gaddafi before his attention was sidetracked elsewhere. So, broad brush discussion today. Going to give you a quick run through of the history of US involvement in Africa in the past 50 years. Explain current US interests and how they translate into policy objectives. Go through some of America's most important bilateral relationships in Africa. Quick run through some of the priority conflicts on the continent, the barriers in the way of US objectives, and then hopefully take your questions. So plenty to get through, and I'll get underway now. So this broad outline here, I think if you go through, take a glance through history, the thing that strikes you is the remarkable continuity in US relations towards Africa since the end of the Second World War. I have this copied out, this regional policy statement on sub-Saharan Africa from 1950. It says, "It's in the national interest of the United States to achieve the following objectives in Africa. Number one, social, political, and economic advancement of the people of Africa. Number two, political and economic stability sufficient to resist domination by unfriendly movements or powers. Number three, maintenance of our strategic interests, including access to strategic raw materials. And the last one, advancement of US business interests, including the securing of non-discriminatory treatment for US nationals." Well, you know, this policy statement could have been given last week in many ways, I think, by the Assistant Secretary of State. So, you know, there has been a lot of continuity, I think. So the US really became a player in Africa at the end of the Second World War. The end of the war, the European powers which had colonized the vast majority of the continent were impoverished and stripped of their power. The US emerged greatly strengthened. Europeans desperate for assistance to rebuild their shattered economies. So the US used this pressure to put pressure on the UK, on France, the other colonial powers, to wind down their colonial adventure in Africa in return for economic support and concentration on their own continent. So as a result, I think the US built up a store of goodwill among many African nations who saw them as, you know, backing the right side of history in their fight for freedoms. Still, it wasn't until 1958, on the eve of the first big wave of African independence, that the State Department founded the Bureau of African Affairs. Defining objective at the time was to prepare these African colonies for independence. President Eisenhower at the time drew up guidelines for policy towards Africa, and again, most of them remain pretty durable, I think, to this day. The first one, treat all independent African governments as sovereign equals. The second, accept African neutrality in the Cold War, which we'll come on to soon. Third, emphasize economic development, education, and cultural exchange. Next, look first to the UN Security Council for stabilization solutions. And the last one, refrain from putting US military boots on the ground in African conflicts. So again, a lot of overlap between current policy, I would argue, today. So this was an era, as the African countries reached independence in a big rush in the late 50s, early 60s, era of great optimism and expectation. Advisors from the US were sent to all of the newly independent nations, agronomists, economists, health specialists, teachers, and so on. You had the Peace Corps founded in 1961, which concentrated very heavily on Africa. And then there was this sort of general altruistic desire, I think, to help Africans as they embarked on their new independence. Of course, that altruistic desire was, there was another motivation behind it, because the Cold War meant winning the support and UN backing of this large group of new nations. Despite President Eisenhower's desire to respect neutrality, Cold War geopolitics did rear its head repeatedly in Africa up until the end of the 1980s. First in Congo, which collapsed almost instantaneously upon independence in 1960. Its left-leaning Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, was seen as susceptible to Soviet influence. He met an untimely death, and there have been allegations to this day of CIA involvement in his murder. The Cold War also played out, became a hot war in Somalia, Ethiopia, and also Angola, all to the detriment of these nations. As you saw the first decade of independence, the 1960s, really it became defined by one-party states in Africa, based mainly around the parties and the personalities that won independence. Also by very close supervision and intervention in national economies. So you had these very inefficient state-owned enterprises, bloated public sector payrolls, where new leaders had to use patronage to win support and provide jobs for their people. Now these policies started to take their toll in the 1970s with slumping economic performance, indebtedness, And then you had the worldwide slump in commodity prices, which really hit African economies hard as primary exporters, many of them. And the oil shock put the squeeze also on those majority of African countries which needed to import petroleum products. So in the 70s, you had the Nixon and Ford administrations really starting to reflect a growing disillusionment with the way Africa was going, and directing its assistance increasingly away from inefficient governments and trying to focus more on bypassing governments and giving direct service provision to African people and NGOs. The 1980s were when the chickens really came home to roost for many African countries who were basically bankrupt by this stage. Eventually had to accept the help of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, who offered cheap loans but with tough conditions attached. African governments had to restructure their economies, slash their public sectors, curb inflation. So you had these so-called structural adjustment policies, which ultimately had quite a positive effect in those countries which stuck by the rules. But there was, in the meantime, a huge cost in social terms, a lot of hardship, and many Africans, when you speak to them today, still haven't forgotten the humiliation of this period and have this residual feeling of hatred almost towards the World Bank and IMF for this. On the diplomatic side, a lot of energy, increasing amount of energy spent on trying to end conflicts, particularly in Southern Africa. President Carter involved in the negotiations that led to Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. In South Africa, meanwhile, the campaign against apartheid gathered pace, led not by the president, President Reagan by then, but grassroots campaigners in the US. The US Congress responded, overriding the presidential veto in order to enact, finally, sanctions against South Africa. Same during this period, you had a big push to end the civil war in Angola, and partial success there. And these efforts to end war and also to promote democracy started to gather pace as you went into the 1990s. President Bush Sr. made a positive contribution to ending wars in Ethiopia, Mozambique. But there's one war where the US didn't intervene, which people remember, of course, the most, and I'm talking about Rwanda in 1994, when the genocide met really very little response from the international community. President Clinton admitted that the failure to support the UN intervention in Rwanda was one of the biggest regrets of his presidency. And actually his decision was coloured really by the disastrous outcome of another US intervention months earlier in Somalia, which ended in a military disaster in which 19 US American soldiers were killed. Now, entering the 2000s, you had much more interest building in Africa on the policy side. George W. Bush was very active in Africa. While his popularity plummeted at home, it actually soared in the African continent, thanks to a string of initiatives to tackle HIV/AIDS, malaria. The really showpiece policy of this was PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. In economic terms, there were some positive initiatives. Really, you had spearheaded the principle for the first time of selectivity, making development assistance conditional on good governance and economic reform. The headline program for this strategy was the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which essentially offered big development grants to nations which advance democracy and improve their standards of governance. There were also some major diplomatic successes in Africa during this period, namely the peace deal which ended Africa's longest-running civil war between North and South Sudan in 2005. And then, of course, you had the belated recognition of the increasing strategic importance of Africa with the formation of the first US military command dedicated to Africa, AFRICOM, which was stood up in 2008. So what are the common threads of this quick dash through history? Well, the first is to emphasize the continuity, I think, in approach, essentially bipartisan as well, continuity across the parties here domestically. I think really it's true to say the overriding objective has been economic and social development in Africa. There have been different motivations, of course, for this. During the Cold War, a desire to win allies was important. But there's also been really a strong humanitarian impulse that's run through US approach to Africa as well, which is maintained today and often led here in the US by very well organized domestic constituencies. I think worth noting the role of the churches, for example, in the anti-apartheid campaign, and also student movements and NGOs on the war in Darfur, for example, more recently. Next slide, please. Thanks. So on to current US interests. Many of the themes I've outlined relevant today. Here's what I would list as the current US interests in Africa. Opening up economic development in markets for trade remains a big priority. The US wants to increase exports to Africa on the back of sustained economic growth in many countries now. Closely linked to this agenda is the humanitarian impulse I mentioned. The US is committed to alleviating poverty, hunger, disease, responding to disasters, as we're seeing now in the Horn of Africa. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because societies which are healthy and wealthy and educated tend to thrive economically and offer trading markets for the US. Winning diplomatic support. US dominance in the world now, as you know, is being challenged by a new set of rising powers and ideologies. And as this sort of emerging multipolar world takes shape, the US has to be very attentive and responsive to the needs of Africa's 54 countries and UN votes as well. Energy, another important priority. The US is recognizing the need to become less dependent on the Middle East for its oil supplies, and Africa in many ways is an attractive alternative with plentiful supplies and discovery prospects, friendlier governments in general, easier transport routes from the west coast of Africa. And currently around 15–17% of the US oil comes from sub-Saharan Africa, and that figure is likely to increase in the coming years. And finally, the other important US interest is dealing with security threats, of which there are many: terrorism, drug trafficking, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, and so on. Since the US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, and of course the attacks on 9/11, there's been an appreciation, as Jean mentioned at the outset, that these so-called ungoverned spaces can't be allowed to remain in chaos, because they provide breeding grounds for the kinds of people who might one day cause harm to the United States. So countries that were once seen as insignificant backwaters, Mali, Niger, many of the countries in the Sahel region, for example, suddenly important. Similarly, if South American drug traffickers can funnel cocaine through West Africa into Europe, well, these profits that they make are generally channeled into more drug production and movement into the United States on this border. So, African governments, if they don't have the ability or the resources to meet these security challenges, then there's a long-term problem for the US. Similarly, if African governments aren't able to contain health pandemics within their borders, there's a risk of spread as well. So, next slide, please. How do these US interests translate into policy priorities? Well, if you listen to the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Johnny Carson, in his policy speeches, he often outlines these 5 US policy priorities. First one, promoting good governance and democracy, consistently listed by this current administration as its #1 policy goal in Africa, one which underpins all others. The idea, of course, that citizens are less likely to enjoy peace and security and economic growth unless they have accountable, representative, competent governments and functioning institutions. This point was underlined by President Obama early in his administration during his first and still only visit to Africa as president, in a speech to the parliament in Ghana, where he said that Africa needed strong institutions, not strong men. Of course, matching this rhetoric with actions is difficult. Africa made great progress in many ways during the 1990s in democratization, with multi-party elections held in many countries. But these gains have slowed or even reversed in some countries more recently. Freedom House, which does this sort of annual survey of political rights and civil liberties across the world, found in 2010 in its survey there were only 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that it rated free. Back in 2005 there were 11. So there's been a decline more recently. Also a recent trend of disputed election outcomes, of losing candidates crying foul, and leading really to democratic deadlock in some countries. I'm thinking Kenya, Zimbabwe, and most recently in Cote d'Ivoire during the last election there. The second policy priority, fostering economic development. 2 main ways traditionally that the US has tried to advance this goal, and that's giving aid and promoting trade. In aid, still a huge amount of assistance given by the US to Africa. Look only at the disaster relief in the Horn of Africa right now. The US gave Sudan, which is a big priority country, at least $1 billion in aid last year, and that's increased this year as well. At the same time, though, it's clear that the US wants to distribute its aid in a smarter way. That's why I think initiatives like the Millennium Challenge Corporation advance this idea of selectivity and giving US taxpayers value for money by investing in nations that prove they have the ability to spend it wisely. Agriculture has recently emerged as a priority area in terms of development. You've had President Obama's Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative, worth $3.5 billion. Really a long overdue initiative. Agriculture and agriculture research has been really neglected for many years in US development policy, and the combination of rising food prices in 2008 and recent famines and droughts has underlined the importance of this work. The new plan in this initiative really involves getting host countries to take the lead in drawing up proposals that are going to help them, involving large-scale, usually industrial agriculture, the application of science and technology as well in agriculture. On trade, the US essentially is trying to address the fact that Africa still accounts for less than 2% of world trade. For example, in 2008, only 1.8% of US exports went to Africa, only 4% of US imports came from Africa. The current administration is continuing with an initiative begun under President Clinton, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. AGOA essentially offers African countries duty-free access to the US for around 6,000 goods. Essentially, there's been a fairly mixed record so far. Although there are 38 countries that are eligible, only a few have been able to take full advantage, and they tend to be the more economically developed countries already, like South Africa, which already have a sort of manufacturing base to build on. And it's not exactly succeeded as a project in broadening the range of goods produced by Africans. Oil and minerals still make up 95% roughly of the imports under AGOA. Removing the barriers to international trade, of course, remains a really difficult challenge for the current administration. Little progress on that recently. But also the onus is being placed on African countries that they need to remove barriers to internal trade themselves. There's such an amount of bureaucratic business involved in setting up a company in most African countries. A lot of restrictions on trade between countries. So, tackling that barrier is a long-term challenge as well. Moving to the third policy priority, advancing public health. In this area, the current administration has tried to build on the PEPFAR project I mentioned under President Bush, which has seen nearly 2 million people with HIV/AIDS receive antiretroviral drugs. The Obama administration has followed through on this policy, expanded it. So you have the Global Health Initiative, which is a 6-year commitment worth $63 billion, so it's a huge, huge effort. A number of challenges going forward, I think, and really it's really the main one being the need for the US to come up with a long-term strategy for tackling HIV and AIDS. So far, a good job has been done on treatment, but the fact remains that for every 2 people put on treatment, you have 5 new infections. So this is clearly an unsustainable project and a huge financial commitment, which is also tending to swallow up other important aspects of development aid to Africa as well. Resolving conflict, number 4, obviously a very important policy priority in Africa. And I'll go through some of the priority conflicts in a moment. I think many of you are from DoD here, so I won't tell you all about your own organisation, AFRICOM, in too much detail, but for those who don't know too much about it, became operational in 2008 to reflect this growing challenge of resolving conflict and recognising the strategic importance of Africa. It was initially very controversial with African countries, mainly because they were suspicious of US intentions. Given their colonial history, they were worried that this sort of initiative smacked of neo-colonialism. And partly to allay these fears, AFRICOM put its HQ not in Africa but in Germany, and really that decision will be reviewed next year, but it's hard to see AFRICOM moving to anywhere on the African continent anytime soon. The AFRICOM tries to portray itself as a competent command plus, emphasising its role in preventing conflict as well as rather than just intervening when it breaks out. So the main emphasis in this area is through building partner capacity, that is helping Africans to establish their own professional competent militaries which respect human rights and rule of law, are subordinate to a civilian authority. The ultimate aim here is that African nations will one day be able to deal with their own security problems and also contribute peacekeepers to assist their neighbours on the continent as well. So you have a whole string of joint training exercises, equipment sales, particular emphasis on getting African countries and militaries to work together. So you're seeing a concentration on helping the regional aspects of Africa, getting the stand-up of the African Union's regional standby forces. Priority gaps in this area that need filling, and the US is trying to do so. Maritime security, from where many of the security challenges that Africans are facing originally emanate. At its heart, AFRICOM, of course, is a competent command, despite the phase 0 stuff. You've seen AFRICOM lead a military operation this year in Libya for a month or 2 before NATO took charge. So it's going to be interesting, probably a little bit too early to tell yet whether there's been any blowback from that intervention. Certainly, although the 3 countries on the UN, 3 African countries currently on the UN Security Council voted for the resolution for military action in Libya, they've since complained about it very vociferously. So watch this space. The final big priority, dealing with transnational threats. And this is a very broad category, newly emerging threats, some of which will require long-term strategic thinking. So far, not much progress on these threats, really just an awareness that they exist. Some of the more obvious ones and the ones where you have had proactive efforts, terrorism, really limited in recent years to Somalia, parts of the East African coast, the Sahel and Maghreb regions in North Africa, and then more recently worries about expansion downwards into northern Nigeria. You have a lot of programs to deal with this threat. The main one in the Horn of Africa is the Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, based in Djibouti, which is the US's only largest base on the continent. Most of the work there by CJTF HOA is on civil affairs projects, actually, like community medical care, bridge and well construction, as well as sort of doing the kinetic stuff. In the Sahel, the main US program has been the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terrorism Partnership, which is a military partnership with the State Department. It's focused on, again, on training capacity in these nations, which are very, very weak states, and possibly getting weaker at the moment as well, with the spillover effects of the Libya conflict and potential worries about arms flows into that region. A report only today that Gaddafi loyalist convoy has crossed the border into Niger, headed who knows where. So you know, this just shows the difficulties that these countries have maintaining security within their own borders. Criminal networks, another big transnational threat. I mentioned drug trafficking before, but also the smuggling of people, of arms, stolen oil in West Africa. You know, a really complex set of challenges. Many of them rooted in or taking advantage or fueling corruption in states which have very weak capacities. So much so that in places like Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, you have really essentially a narco state where South American drug traffickers are essentially running the show there. The US military, State Department, tackling this issue, but it's very multi-dimensional and it requires complex interaction of intelligence cooperation, security sector reform, and economic development as well. One transnational threat where there has been a robust response is piracy, particularly off the coast of Somalia. You saw great speed in which the international community put together a contact group on this issue, set up joint maritime patrols, really fueled in many cases here by very sort of overexcited media coverage and general awareness of this problem. But it's not really solved. It's really not dealing with the essential root causes of piracy, which are found on land in Somalia. And really the pirates are just migrating further and further outwards over a really vast area now. So also you've really not seen much attention so far to the persistent and growing problem of piracy off the coast of West Africa. I'm going to go to the next slide now and talk about some of the key US allies in Africa. When you hear the Assistant Secretary of State talk about this issue, he routinely talks of two countries as being the most important in Africa, South Africa and Nigeria. Why South Africa? Well, far and away Africa's most important economy, is an important sort of leadership voice traditionally on the continent. Currently even more important, it has a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So the US is seeking South African cooperation on a whole raft of issues: nuclear non-proliferation, trade, climate change negotiations, not least because South Africa hosts the next UN climate change conference at the end of this year. But this is a very difficult, testy relationship. Partly, I think, a hangover, a legacy issue of the past. South Africans having forgotten the US support for the apartheid, or well, failure to oppose at least the apartheid regime for many years. There's also been some serious personality clashes. By all accounts, President Bush and Mbeki couldn't stand the sight of each other. And there are some really serious policy differences as well. South Africa tends to see its role on the international stage as defending the interests of the South, the non-aligned movement, the other BRICS nations against the established powers. It was very critical of AFRICOM, and during its first stint on the UN Security Council, it sided with China and Russia to vote against resolutions condemning human rights abuses in Burma, Zimbabwe, Iran. You've had some improvement in relations, at least on a personal basis, between Presidents Obama and Zuma, but really re-emerging problems in terms of bilateral relations. On Libya, South Africa has not been very helpful in holding back in releasing funds to the new Transitional National Council in Libya. been dragging its feet for a long time on Zimbabwe and resolving the political crisis there, although there's some signs in the last few months that Zuma is ready to get tough on Robert Mugabe. But I think overall there's still a feeling that in the US administration that South Africans could play a more constructive or active leadership role on the continent, and that, for example, defence cooperation could be ramped up. Nigeria, important for many obvious reasons, Africa's largest democracy, although a troubled one, most populous country, big influence on the continent, at least historically, important regional player, also the biggest provider of oil to the US on the African continent. In fact, the US, I think, is the 5th largest or 4th largest at times supplier to the US, level with Saudi Arabia, roughly. Unfortunately, it's been a very unstable, volatile country in recent years. Ethnic, regional, religious tensions, history of bad government, rampant corruption, communal violence. You have had a long-running insurgency in the oil-producing Niger Delta region. The growing threat now of Islamist terrorism in the northeast, now kind of trickling down to the capital, Abuja, as well. So a huge raft of troublesome issues on the agenda. In some ways, elections are a kind of focal point for instability in Nigeria, and vote rigging as well. But there were some encouraging signs in the last presidential election back in April, which was seen as the sort of the fairest since independence. Although you still had 800 people die in post-election violence, which is just sort of shows the size of the challenge in Nigeria, and a very worrying north-south split in political allegiance, which is mirrored in some ways on religious lines as well. So relations are held back by some of these problems, and also the fact that Nigeria likes to see itself as the most important nation in Africa, not too interested in offers of assistance, particularly on the military side. I mean, it likes getting the equipment, but doesn't like the instruction on how to use it and what to do with it, maybe. So there's a few issues there. I'll run through just very quickly some of the other important relationships as well. Kenya, really a history of warm relations with the US, some hiccups on the way, but it remains East Africa's most important economy, very cooperative on anti-terrorism and security, family links for the president, of course, and a big recipient of US aid, particularly in health spending. But again, somewhat like Nigeria, it's a country that's sort of on the cusp. It could go either way, make really some far-reaching reforms that would put it on the road to long-term stability, or take a step back, and we're really in that moment now. Just under a year to go before the next elections. The last elections ended up in 1,500 people being killed in violence, many more being made homeless. So really the country is currently grappling with these issues. It's passed a new constitution last year, which looks very good on paper and resolves some of the governance issues that have overwhelmed Kenya in the past. But of course, implementing a constitution is the key thing, not just writing one and passing one. As the elections approach, you have another problem looming on the horizon. That's the International Criminal Court, which is in the process of prosecuting 6 of the alleged ringleaders of the post-election violence last time round. 2 of them have ambitions to become president. So again, plenty of potential for a rocky road ahead. Just finally, a quick mention to about some of the problematic allies. These are often repressive governments whose misdeeds are often overlooked by the US and other Western partners because they serve some other useful purpose. Maybe as security partners, maybe because they're good at spending governance money and development money in a transparent way, but really are dragging their feet on other issues, namely democracy and good governance. So countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda fall into this bracket. We just recently, and I've left copies for you to pick up if you're interested. We just recently did a big survey of 10 African countries. It's actually commissioned by AFRICOM. I wanted us to take a 10-year look at 10 countries and try and analyse some of the stress points and potentials for instability in these countries. Well, the 3 countries that were flagged as the most at risk in this survey, aside from Sudan, which isn't a case all by itself, were Ethiopia, Uganda, and Rwanda. Countries that on the surface look fairly stable and secure, but actually have very authoritarian and repressive governments, unwilling to cede political space or allow legitimate political opposition to take shape, and really through their failure to manage dissent or tolerate opposition, are storing up problems for the future. All 3 countries very dependent on a very strong individual as president, and all 3 facing the prospect of succession issues as well, which could undermine stability. Finally, a word about Angola, sort of often listed as a potential partner, potential rather than actual for the United States. A country of real growing importance in Africa, the 2nd largest oil producer after Nigeria. Really quite a remarkable recovery, seeing as less than 10 years ago it was in the midst of a really terrible civil war. The US is trying to build relations with Angola. Again, legacy issues cloud the relationship in that the US backed the rebel movement, which ended up on the losing side of the civil war. And China, in the meantime, has got in on the game and has big, important economic relations with Angola. So the US has begun a strategic dialogue partnership with Angola, but really hasn't yet borne much fruit. Next slide, thank you. I won't bore you for much longer, I promise. I'll open things up for questions. But a word about some of the priority conflicts currently in the African continent that the US feels it has to engage with. Now, the first thing to say is that the resources available for the US government in Africa are extremely limited. Even though Africa is growing in importance, it still remains fairly low on the overall priority list, at least in budget terms. And that budget is going to be squeezed yet further in the coming years, inevitably. So policymakers have to sort of engage in a sort of triage, deciding which of the many competing crises need the most urgent attention. That said, it's important to remember that Africa is not the kind of continent at war that sometimes is imagined in the popular conception. The frequency and longevity of conflict has declined in recent years. You don't have, and most of the conflicts now are essentially internal conflicts involving armed groups, whether they're insurgents, revolutionaries, as you have in Libya right now, criminal gangs, rebels, essentially engaging in resource grabs, ethnic militia, as you've seen in many countries, and hired thugs often to help secure election victories or keep a losing candidate in office. Many of these groups have political motives, often a share, or maybe not just a share, all of the power in the centre that they're trying to grab, desire to oust governing elites or ethnic groups, and religious motivations in a few areas, although religious extremism is not generally a source of conflict in most of Africa. Some of the most confounding and upsetting conflicts are really, the motivation really behind them is nothing more than pillage and destruction. Take, for example, the Lord's Resistance Army, which is really with a group of no more than a couple of hundred armed men and young men, wreaked destruction across four nations in the Great Lakes and region of Africa. Some of the long-term commitments in terms of US priorities in addressing conflict, I would cite Sudan at the top of the list. Long history of involvement, diplomatic, economic resources that the US has put into Sudan, first in helping to end the civil war in 2005, then helping to ensure that post-Civil War agreement held, culminating earlier this year, at the start of the year, in the referendum in southern Sudan on independence, and independence coming about just 2 months ago now at the start of July. The US continues to be involved closely in Sudan, and there's a real tough road ahead, I think, for both Sudans. Huge development challenge in the south, and a lot of internal security challenges as that young nation tries to get up on its feet. The north, the state that's left behind, even more worrying, and really I think there's a danger of Sudan that's left behind disintegrating as the government in the centre continues with a sort of a predatory approach to peripheral regions, and then you get essentially an uptick in rebel movements there. Right now you're seeing that in the southern areas of southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. Somalia is the other priority conflict I want to give a quick mention to. Forced its way up the agenda and in recent years because of the rise of its own homegrown terrorist group, also with some foreign helpers, Al-Shabaab, which has shown in the past year its ability to launch terrorist attacks, not just in Somalia, but outside Somalia, in Uganda as well. The US has a Somali diaspora to take heed of here, and there's been some, very limited, but some movement in terms of finance and training of some members of the Somali diaspora here going to Somalia. For the time being, the US invests its hope in a sort of government in waiting in Somalia, the transitional federal government, but confidence in that institution is at an all-time low. The TFG really doesn't control much of Somalia outside the capital, Mogadishu. It's criminally corrupt, and really just hasn't shown any ability that it is a credible government in the future. To reflect, I think, this loss of confidence in the TFG, the State Department launched a policy review and now has a so-called dual-track approach to Somalia, where it tries to engage with other governance authorities within that country, which hasn't had a central government now since 1991. So I think you'll see continued involvement in Somalia, and of course at the moment the political situation is being overwhelmed rather by the humanitarian situation, where in excess of 12 million people are under direct threat of food insecurity, or in fact starvation in south-central Somalia. A few forgotten, neglected conflicts, but we can talk about these more in the Q&A. I don't want to ramble on for too much longer. But the DRC, I think, is a country that really needs renewed attention and focus. A very complicated country, multi-layered, long-running crisis. The figures may be contested, but estimates are that nearly 5.5 million people died in Congo and DRC since 1998 as a result of the various conflicts here. Really gets very little attention, I think partly because of the resources needed to address it, the complexity of the DRC and its problems. So really you get sort of pinprick type initiatives addressing the conflict minerals problem in the east of the country, this sort of epidemic of rapes of women you're getting again in the eastern part of the country by various armed groups, but also official government troops as well. There really no concerted attempt, I would say, to address the root cause of these problems, which is the lack of governance from the centre, from the central government. You have a key election coming up this year in November, presidential and legislative elections. The international community is going to be watching closely, but it's committed very little in terms of finance and funding to support these elections. Their view is that this is the election for the Congolese, that the Congolese have to take the lead for the first time. I'm very sceptical that this is going to work in a very satisfactory way. The LRA I mentioned, we can talk about that, the Lord's Resistance Army in questions if you like. I'm just going to wrap things up by the final slide. There are a couple more, but challenges to US objectives in Africa, and just outline a few of the key ones. I've mentioned some of them already. The first and most important, I think, is the limited resources available in Africa. Limits what the US can achieve, it limits US presence on the continent. The needs are great, the resources are really, really stretched. The Africa Bureau of the State Department is the least well-funded of all the regional bureaus of the State Department. $226 million in 2009, which that's a lot of ground to cover for a small amount of money. An Inspector General's report back in 2009 highlighted some of these problems, short staffing, particularly at senior and mid-level. You know, it's just a pinprick in terms of resources. And at the same time, the demands are getting greater. Embassy staff have to, hand out these massive, manage and hand out resources for PEPFAR and some of the other development aid packages, this creates huge pressure and really limits the ability of foreign service officers and other diplomats to get out of the embassy. At the same time, another challenge is that the resources are tending to be skewed in favour of the military resources. One of the main concerns that have been raised about AFRICOM is that the Department of Defence is now administering such a big chunk of US development assistance, close to a quarter in Africa. This has led to accusations that there's a confusion over AFRICOM's proper role, some concerns and some resentment from civilian agencies that US policy towards Africa is becoming militarized. The Inspector General's report I mentioned said that there was a danger, I quote, that the US military is stepping into the void created by a lack of resources for traditional development and public diplomacy. So a mismatch of resources is another issue of debate. Match those limited resources of the US government overall with the great pressing needs in Africa and the diversity of the continent. And it's really hard, I think, to set realistic, achievable objectives. Danger of kind of approaching Africa in a sort of one-size-fits-all framework, and that doesn't reflect the diversity of the challenges and the different governance structures in Africa. I'm in my job, I tend to be an Afro optimist, but it's not realistic, I think, that Africa is going to suddenly sort of surge forward and overcome its poverty and become an economic dynamo, at least large stretches of it. Some countries will, others won't. There are big problems coming up on the horizon, sort of mega challenges they've been termed, and there are really no policy solutions for them right now. One of them is demographic trends. Africa's already hit 1 billion in terms of population. It's expected to double that number in 28, just under 30 years. So that's a huge population increase. Can economic growth, even if it's carries on at its fairly modest, decent rates at the moment, can it keep up with that population growth? Will these countries be able to feed their citizens? Will they be able to provide enough jobs for their young people? And services, to public services, to cope with the influx of people into the cities, for example. Just a couple of other challenges to outline as well. The last one, I guess, I'll talk about is declining US influence on the continent. The US has not been engaged in Africa in a concerted way. That's changed in the last sort of 10 years plus, but there were many years where there wasn't much of a US presence in many African countries. In the meantime, other countries have increased in importance on the international stage. China is the one I'll mention very briefly. Just recently, 2 years back, overtook the US in terms of its volume of trade in Africa, $120 billion plus last year of trade with Africa. And the other BRIC nations, India, Brazil in particular, are also engaging in Africa in a big way. And these are nations with wealth and influence, and also different rules for handing out money, negotiating deals. The assertiveness of these countries, I think, weakens the ability of the US to get its own way and promote its objectives such as good governance and democracy on the continent. China, everyone always wants to talk about China's growing influence in Africa. I think there's a tendency to play up the sources of division. There are common interests in security, economic growth, building markets, and so on. So I think there are areas for, if not outright cooperation, collaboration at least. One of the countries that will be interesting to see if this can work successfully is in South Sudan, where China has big oil interests, but the US has taken on the bulk of the development burden. So is there going to be a more equitable sharing of responsibilities in this young country? It'll be interesting to see. I think I'm going to wrap things up there because I've spoken for way too long now. But just a couple of closing points to the last slide, or even I've skipped that one. So and the next one as well. Thanks. I want to stress finally the continuity of US policy. Some of the emerging challenges I mentioned, the demographics, the mega trends. But overall, these continued interests that span the last 50, 60 years of US interaction, economic development, conflict prevention, and those will remain themes, I think, in the future. And this core objective of the current administration, which is at the sort of root of all of the policy approaches right now towards Africa, and that's improving governance and strengthening institutions. So thanks for your patience, and just a final slide actually that has some useful resources that I find good on Africa in terms of getting information. And I did this last time I came here and spoke, and I get a pat on the back for it, but the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies puts out this great media guide wrap-up every morning, wrap-up of all the sort of latest, most important media stories from Africa. I find that a very useful way to start the day, and recommend you take a look at that as well. So thanks very much, and take your questions.